Imagine designing a tank to sprint across open desert, then dropping it into a world where standing still gets you killed, but moving gets you hunted from the sky. A machine built to lead armored spearheads now waits in the shadows, takes one shot, and disappears before the enemy even realizes what hit them. That is what happened to America's M1 Abrams in Ukraine. Washington shipped over its symbol of armored dominance, expecting it to punch holes in Russian lines. Instead, Ukraine quietly rewrote the playbook so hard that US generals are now studying Ukrainian tactics to understand how their own tank survives the next war. This is not a story about a miracle weapon. It is a story about a doctrinal shot, about how a small fleet of tanks, outnumbered, exposed to drones, and stripped of air supremacy, forced the most powerful army on Earth to admit the way we thought tanks would fight is over. Before we break down how Ukraine completely rewired the way the Abrams fight, take a second to support the channel. If you're interested in serious, fact-based breakdowns of modern warfare, hit like and tell us in the comments what you want the next deep dive to cover more on Ukraine's drone warfare, US armor doctrine, or another front in this conflict. And let us know, do you think heavy tanks still have a future on a drone-saturated battlefield? Or are we watching the end of an era? Your thoughts genuinely shape what comes next. When the first 31 Abrams rolled into Ukraine, the expectation was familiar. Use heavy armor to crack fortified lines, blast through trenches, restore momentum to a grinding front. On paper, it made sense. The Abrams has earned its reputation for decades. Thick armor, brutal firepower, a fire control system that turns distant targets into routine kill. In a classic combined arms offensive, with artillery shaping the battlefield and friendly aircraft overhead, it is a monster. But that is not the war Ukraine is fighting. By the time those tanks were ready for combat, the front was wired with mines, covered in artillery, and above all, flooded with cheap suicidal drones looking for anything big and expensive to burn. Russian FPV teams had already learned how to hunt Western tanks from above, where armor is thinner and angles are unforgiving. Surveillance drones lingered over every tree line. Artillery batteries waited with pre-plotted grid, ready to turn a single thermal signature into a kill zone. The Abrams did not arrive in the war it was built for. It arrived in the war that is coming for everyone. Ukraine could have tried to use the Abrams the way the US always imagined, spearheading assaults, charging across open ground, daring the enemy to stop it. Instead, commanders did something far more dangerous to American assumptions. They refused to play that role. They began to treat Abrams tanks not as hammers, but as snipers on tracks. A typical engagement now looks nothing like the glossy recruiting videos. Drones scout first, mapping enemy vehicles, anti-tank teams, and likely ambush points. And Abrams moves up only to a pre-selected, covered firing position, often hull down behind a berm, tree line, or ruined structure. The tank exposes as little as possible, often just the gun in the sight. 1 or 2 rounds, smoke, reverse, relocate before Russian drones and artillery can stack a kill chain on top of that last known grid. Shoot, scoot, vanish. Not as a desperate trick, but as the core of the doctrine. Ukrainian crews have described exactly this kind of employment. Short exposures, long-range shots, immediate displacement, because the alternative is simple. If you sit, you die. The Abrams, one of the heaviest tanks on Earth, is being used like a ghost with a 120mm cannon. For American armor culture, raised on desert storms and thunder runs, that is already a shock. Why can the Abrams afford to fight this way? Because its real edge is not just armor. It is the speed between seeing and killing. Even in downgraded export form, the tank brings advanced thermal imagers that turn a cold field into a living map of engines, optics, and careless movement. A laser rangefinder and ballistic computer that make long-range hits routine, even against fleeting targets. A stabilized gun and independent commander's sight that let the crew hunt for the next target while the current one is already dying. In a battlefield cell built around that tank, everything is designed to compress time. A drone team calls out a vehicle edging along a tree line. The commander already has the route to a hull-down nook in his head. The driver moves just enough to clear the shot. The gunner does not need 3 salvos to walk rounds onto target. He needs 1. Then the clock takes over. Every extra second the tank stays is a second Russian FPV teams can lock on. Every plume of dust, every hot engine is a beacon for artillery and loitering munitions, so the doctrine is ruthless. Hit, disappear. If a target is not worth risking the vehicle, you do not take the shot. This exposes a truth the US can no longer ignore. In a battlefield saturated with sensors, survival is not just about thickness of steel. It is about discipline, timing, and signature control. Reality has been harsh. Ukraine has lost a significant portion of its tiny Abrams fleet, many to drones and top attack munitions, rather than classic tank-on-tank duels. Open source imagery and Ukrainian officers themselves have described FPV drones striking from above or the flanks, where armor is weaker, tanks immobilized by mines, and then finished by drones or artillery. Vehicles stalked along roads that were safe in the morning and lethal by dusk. By spring 2024, US and Ukrainian officials acknowledged the reality. The Abrams was too visible, too valuable, and too vulnerable to leave permanently on the hottest parts of the front. Ukrainian forces began to pull the tanks back from exposed frontline roles, reserving them for carefully planned, high-value missions rather than routine trench line grinding. From Washington's perspective, it was a grim lesson. The White House and Pentagon had once sold the deployment as a symbol of unwavering support and high-end capability. A year later, senior officials were admitting publicly that these tanks had not had the impact they hoped, and that in this kind of war, they were not useful in the way Americans imagined. That is the shock. Not that the Abrams is bad, but that the environment has changed faster than the doctrine. Ukraine did not stop at tactics. It began to physically rewrite the tank itself. Across the front, images have shown reactive armor and add-on panels bolted to vulnerable spots to disrupt drone and missile impacts. Cables, chains, and metal grills forming cages over turrets and engine decks to catch or deflect FPVs. Rubber skirts and covers over running gear to protect tracks and wheels from small warheads. Field-made nets and screens that fold over crew hatches and key access points. In some cases, Ukrainian industry and volunteers report new protective kits that aim to make Abrams much more resistant to common drone attack profiles, claims that may be overstated, but clearly show the adaptation trend. From an American standpoint, this is uncomfortable and invaluable at the same time. Here is a premier US platform in the hands of a partner, being hacked, reinforced, and reimagined under real fire in ways no training exercise could replicate. Inside the Pentagon, none of this is happening in a vacuum. Senior officers and program managers have openly acknowledged that what is happening to tanks in Ukraine on both sides has forced a reckoning. In the last few years, the US Army has scrapped a planned heavy upgrade path for the existing Abrams in favor of a new, lighter, more survivable M1E3 concept. Stressed the need to reduce logistical footprint and weight because a tank that is too heavy and too fuel hungry becomes a static target. Focused on integrating protection against top attack threats, drones, loitering munitions, smart missiles into any future design. Pushed harder on active protection systems, networking, and teaming with unmanned vehicles. US generals have admitted that the Abrams was designed to shrug off direct fire from other tanks, not to survive swarms of cheap FPVs diving from the sky. The war in Ukraine has made that vulnerability impossible to ignore, and Ukraine's shoot-and-scoot, sensor-driven tactics are now being studied as a preview of how US armor will have to operate in any future high-end conflict. The export customer has become the live fire teacher. Ukraine's real innovation is not just tanks plus drones. It is how each piece is subordinated to information and survivability. A typical local fight around a few Abrams today might look like this. Drones fan out first, mapping trenches, gun teams, suspected artillery hides. Electronic warfare units probe enemy drones, jam control links, and create temporary blind spots. Artillery does not fire long, dramatic barrages. It delivers short, precise pulses of smoke or suppression, timed to seconds. Infantry moves last, exploiting tiny windows in which Russian observers are blinded or dead. The Abrams sits at the center of this web, but not at the front of the column. Its job is to remove key pieces from the enemy's local puzzle: a bunker pinning down a platoon, a self-propelled gun spotted between salvos, an armored vehicle anchoring a strong point. Each engagement is small, each effect is local, but over hours and days, it adds up. Russian units start to assume that if they idle too long, something they cannot see will kill them. Convoys creep, guns relocate sooner. FPV teams waste drones on decoys and empty hides. That is how you stretch 31 tanks into a theater-wide psychological effect. None of this makes the Abrams invincible. Losses have been real and, for Kiev, painful. With such a small fleet, every destroyed hull is a political and operational event. Ukrainian commanders have responded with a cold-blooded pragmatism that also caught US observers off guard. Pull tanks out of sectors where drones and artillery density make survivability close to zero. Reassign them to roles and terrain where long-range fire and concealment matter more than raw armor. Treat each hull less like a symbol and more like a precision asset whose value is measured in repeated, clean engagements, not one dramatic, suicidal charge. For an American institution used to using its armored brigades en masse, under friendly skies and with deep logistics, that mindset is jarring. But it may also be a preview of how US forces will have to think if they ever fight a peer enemy who can see, track, and strike them with relentless, cheap drones. So what exactly has the US learned from this Abrams season in Ukraine? Not that tanks are obsolete, but that old tank doctrine is. From official statements, leaks, and procurement shifts, a pattern emerges. The Abrams is still lethal in direct fire, but without air cover and a robust counter-drone umbrella, it bleeds. Numbers matter. A single battalion of tanks cannot transform a 1,000-kilometer front. Survivability now depends as much on mission control, camouflage, and EW as on armor composition. Any future US tank must be lighter, better protected from above, less fuel-hungry, and born integrated with drones and sensors not retrofitted afterward. Ukraine, fighting for survival with limited resources, reached those conclusions on the battlefield. The US is reshaping billion-dollar programs in response. From the M1 design to new unmanned combat vehicles and layered air defenses for ground forces. That is the real shock for Washington. The Abrams did not simply prove itself or fail. It forced the US Army to admit that its own assumptions about armored warfare are now a liability. Ukraine's Abrams story is messy. Some tanks destroyed, some pulled back, some quietly rewriting what heavy armor even means in the age of drones and precision sensors. But when US officers look at the footage, talk to Ukrainian crews, and watch how this handful of tanks now operate, they are not seeing a dead platform. They are seeing the outline of their own future. A future where tanks stalk instead of charge. Drones see first and armor acts second. Survivability is calculated in seconds of exposure, not inches of steel. And the most feared vehicle on the field is not the one in front of the formation, but the one you never quite see before everything around you starts to explode. Ukraine's Abrams tank strategy has the US shocked is not a headline about a single machine. It is a warning label on the next war. If you found this breakdown useful, it helps a lot if you leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. What should the next video focus on? And what do you think this Abrams shock really means for the future of tanks and modern warfare? Thank you for watching, for thinking critically about these conflicts, and for being part of a community that actually cares about understanding power, not just cheering for it.